I think I'm a little bit less than statistically common here. I come from a Jewish background, and my family was not Orthodox at all. My mother was somewhat observant. My father was not at all, but I wasn't aware of that. But for some strange reason, which I can go into in a private conversation, they decided that I should be educated in a Jewish yeshiva, which is a Jewish parochial school. So I went to parochial school. And when you're a kid, you do what you're told, and you don't understand what anything's about. Then, as time went on, I noticed that all the other kids were getting little stars, for going to synagogue on Saturday morning, and I didn't get a star. And but then I began going with my friend Marty every Saturday to synagogue and so on. Then I went to have my bar mitzvah, I went through the whole thing. But my father was very much a scientific person. He was a doctor, and a very, very smart man. Probably the smartest man I ever met in my life. And one thing he did do is that when I was a little kid coming home from elementary school, I would, come home babbling, and, "Oh, Dad, did you know that God created the unity world in 7 days?" Whatever it is. And my father would just say to me, "How do you know?" Well, the teacher said so. Well, how does the teacher know? Well, the teacher said it was in this book. Well, how do you know the book is right? And they just left it there. He never went into further questioning it, then he would take me to the Museum of Natural History, and in fact, I learned more science from my father, who used to drive me to school in the morning, than I ever learned in elementary school. I didn't have to bother opening a science textbook until I graduated from high school. Because of my stuff my father taught me. But by the time I was around 13, I began reading, and I began reading science, and I latched on to a wonderful book. I recommend it. It's an old one called Unpopular Essays by Bertrand Russell. And what I loved was, first of all, it was reasonable, it was rational, and it was funny. And his presentation of ideas was precise, clear, and logical. So I began doubting, and my mother, being concerned about this, that I was sort of doubting all this stuff, had a holdover the husband of a friend of hers who was a rabbi. He wasn't an ordinary rabbi, he was an academic rabbi who taught in a Jewish academic institution. And he comes over for lunch one day, and I tell him all these doubts I have about, didn't make any sense to me about the Bible being creation and all this, all these the rules of kashrut and so on and so forth. By the way, Ed asked me to sort of give a little bit of, background. I don't know how many of you know much about Judaism, but it's interesting. Anyway, I said to him, I don't, this stuff makes any sense. And he looked at me and he said, "You're absolutely right. It doesn't make sense. This is all fairy tales for children." He said, "Most people just simply are not capable of understanding the true meaning of the religion. Therefore, we have to tell them fairy tales in order for them to have some notion of what this is all about," which shocked me. To me, this was the ultimate elitism, that there was this intelligentsia who would really understand things, but we had to tell the rest of the world fairy tales. And at that point, it sort of like broke any connection I had to this whole thing. I mean, heck with it. But just as a small, and then that just began a whole other series of transformations in terms of my thinking. I just want to mention one other thing, which is very personal, is that when you grow up as a Jewish kid, having been born in 1942, you're aware of the fact that there are people in the world who want to kill you just because of what your ethnicity is. And I frankly would stay up at night worrying about that. And I began thinking about, how would I talk to someone about that? What arguments could I have to defend myself if I were ever confronted? And this began a whole train of thinking in my mind about the value of reason. What does reason mean? Why do we need reason? And to me, that is really the crucial issue, that we as human beings, our entire species, is entirely dependent on our success and our survival and our prospering on reason. And yet, we are not rational animals, despite what some people say. We are animals who are capable of reason. And reason itself is a technology and a discipline. And unless we teach that technology and that discipline, we will always be overwhelmed and always take the wrong choice. Life, in many respects, consists of wants, wishes, desires, which really overwhelms most of what we do. But the only way we get to what we want is by applying reason. Otherwise, we destroy ourselves, and we destroy our communities, we destroy our societies, and ultimately, as it looks like we may be doing, we destroy the world. So that sounds very pessimistic, but I'm hoping that those of us, like us here, will prevent that. Anyway, there's a couple of points that Ed asked that I made. The original language of the Jewish people, supposedly, was Hebrew. And that was a particular early form of a language which was common in the Middle East. It then became something called Aramaic. And that was the language that, if Jesus existed, he would have spoken. He would not have spoken Greek the way the Bible was written. Most likely, although some people did speak Greek, he was not an educated person. He would have known Hebrew as a ritual sort of language. Later on, during the diaspora, the Jews, who moved largely to Middle Europe, combined all the Middle European language, but primarily medieval German, with Hebrew, and came up with a language called Yiddish, or Jewish, as you may hear it. So that some of the things that you hear spoken, or some of the expressions that you may hear, are Yiddish, not Hebrew. So, for example, there are the words like schlemiel and schlemazel. A schlemiel is like the waiter who trips with a tray full of food. The schlemazel is the person he dumps the food on. And you've heard the term mazel tov, which means good luck. Mazel means luck, and tov means good. But the word mazel actually comes from the astrological background. It really means a planet. So it's really saying that you should have good planets when you name astrological signs. So there's some things do come from Hebrew, like you'll hear Jewish people saying good Yom Tov means good holiday, means good. A Yom is a day, and Tov again means good. But the other expressions, for example, my grandmother used to say Sazmer Gal in Yiddish, which is French, which means say Sameh Tegal. But it's Germanicized into that. So the Yiddish is a mixture of French and Polish and German and Hebrew and God knows what else.
What about schmuck?
What?
Schmuck.
Schmuck means a jewel in German. And so the value of the genitals, the male genitals in particular, the testicles, were called jewels. And so it's basically calling someone a prick. Something similar.
Nice.
So, and as a religion, Judaism is very different from Christianity. It is not Christianity manqué or lacking Jesus. Its entire focus is quite different. Maybe I can. First of all, there is no such thing as hell. There's only a very vague notion of heaven at all. The emphasis of the religion is entirely on ethical behavior or obeying the rules. It, as a religion, demands the least of the credulity of all the other religions that I know of. However, it still demands credulity, which is too much for me. But there's no such thing as the Trinity or any of the mysteries, quote unquote, that entails, or any of the other silliness that we are used to. But I'm just going to finish over this joke that I told Ed when I came in today. I thought it was going to be raining. So this is a joke that talks about the difference between the religions, which is about how God decides that the world is too wicked for him to countenance, and he must destroy it, as he did in the days of Noah. So he calls together all of the priests and the rabbis and the ministers of all denominations, and he says, "My shepherds, go ye unto your flocks and prepare them, for the world is too wicked for my ways and must be destroyed by flood as it was in the days of Noah." So the priest gets up in front of his congregation and he says, "My children, come ye to the arms of the Mother Church, for only through the Mother Church shall ye find salvation in the world hereafter. For the world is to be destroyed in 10 days. And the minister says, "People, look to your hearts. For only through true faith shall you find salvation in the world hereafter. And the rabbi gets up in front of his congregation, and he looks to the left, and he looks to the right. He says, okay, people, I want to see some action around here. You've got 10 days to learn how to love underwater.